Now in, and we're recording, right?
Yes.
Good evening. So tonight we are starting a new book. You should have received an email announcing that we're going to be working our way through a book by Traleg Rinpoche called Mind at Ease. Traleg Rinpoche was a wonderful teacher who died all too young. I think he was 56 or 7 when he died a few years ago. And this is one of his books. He was a great admirer of Trungpa Rinpoche, as a by the way, and wonderful teacher in his own right. So we're going to be going through Mind at Ease, which is really about Mahamudra. Let's just start talking about chapter 1, which was the introduction in chapter 1 was the assignment for tonight, part of chapter 1, not the complete chapter. We'll finish the rest of the chapter next week. This book is, they're also going through this book, and the way I got the idea for it for us and in conference with Michael, and is that this is being gone through as well at the Rinpoche Society, which is another Buddhist group based here in Boulder. And I took a look at the book, and Michael did too, and we really liked it. So it's about Mahamudra. Mahamudra is a tradition that developed in India. In fact, let me just go back a bit and talk about how Buddhism developed in India and over the centuries. The Buddha lived traditional dates, although there was no written history at that time. People weren't writing very much, if at all. And so it was, all the events were passed down as oral history from one person to the next. And of course, you know what happens when you pass a story from one person to the next, it changes over time. And in any event, as near as anybody can tell, the usual dates for the Buddha are about 540 to 460 BC, BCE, before the Christian era. So that's 540 to 460, which would have him living about 80 years. Is that right? 560. 540 to 460. That's about it, which would have him living about 80 years. And after he died, the Sangha fractured. Kind of what we're experiencing now with Trungpa Rinpoche students. It's fractured. They're the Shambhala people, they're the Buddhist people. It had already fractured once when Ursel Tenzin, the regent, died in 1990. And now it's fracturing again. And this tends to happen with Buddhist Sanghas that form around a powerful and charismatic teacher. And when that teacher dies, they fracture. And the period after the Buddha's death for a couple of hundred years is known as the period of the 18 schools, because there were supposedly 18 different schools. Now, traces of these schools, or more than traces, have persisted to this day. One of those schools was called the Doctrine of the Elders, the Slavira Elders Vada doctrine. That school went south in India and eventually made its way to Ceylon, where in Ceylonese it's called the Theravada, as you might recognize. And the Theravada spread from Ceylon throughout Southeast Asia, and it's still there today. Another of those schools was called the Doctrine of Everything Exists, the Sarvasti Vada. And that school persisted in India and also went north and eventually became the basis of the Hinayana section of the Tibetan canon. It was, Hinayana teachings. Another school called the Mahasangikas, which means greater Sangha, went east around the time of Christ. The Sthaviravada, the Doctrine of the Elders, went to Ceylon in around 250 BC, but the Mahasangika school went to China at around the time of Christ. And there it became the Mahayana, the greater school, and it spread from China eventually to Japan about 600 or 700 years later, and about to as well as to Korea. And from Korea, it also went to Mongolia, although Tibetan Buddhism went to Tibet and also went to Mongolia. Meanwhile, Buddhism kept developing in India and changing. Buddhism changes all the time. It's not like other religions because there is no official credo, like there is no correlate to the Bible or the Quran. Instead, teachers who achieve some degree of enlightenment or not write about what they've understood, and that becomes new doctrine, appropriate to the people of that time. And so in India, it kept developing. And somewhere around, nobody knows for sure, but around the 5th, somewhere between the 5th and the 8th centuries, lay Buddhists began to co-opt, you might say, Indian Tantra and use it for Buddhist purposes. And this happened outside of the normal school. See, Buddhism, as it developed in India, the standard Buddhism, was primarily a monastic event. It lived in monasteries and in the great universities. There were these great universities, huge universities in India. The biggest was the one called Nalanda, and it's in northern India, just north of Bodh Gaya, where the Buddha achieved enlightenment. And you can go there today. And if you go with a guide, he'll point to the horizon and say it went that far, which is about 10 miles. And supposedly incorporated about 10,000 people. And today there are the remains, they've dug up the remains of buildings that were from that period, which is, 2,000 years ago. And they've created sort of outlines of buildings. You can see them. There were walls going up about 3 or 4 feet. You can actually walk into a house and and see what it was like, or a building. And supposedly 10,000 people were there. And there were at least 2 other great universities called Odantapuri and Vikramashila. And these developed over the centuries until the Muslim invasion of India in the 11th century, 1000s. The Muslims invaded India, and they basically destroyed any images which were they regarded as images of God or images of Buddha, because they regarded them as being sacrilegious. And they also attacked any centers of religion. And of course, Buddhism was located primarily in monasteries, so it was an easy target. And Buddhism was pretty much wiped off the face of India in the 11th century. Hinduism was not, because Hinduism was a lay phenomenon. It lived in the villages, and the Muslims couldn't eradicate that because it was everywhere in India, in the villages. But Buddhism was an easy target, being largely monastic in the monasteries and the universities. Meanwhile, though, prior to the 11th century, starting in around maybe as early as the 5th century, Tantric Buddhism developed in India. And eventually it moved into the universities and monasteries as well. And monastic monks and university monks, Buddhist monks, became Tantric, some of them, many of them. But it also began to move out of India. And it went to China, Tantric Buddhism, where it never developed a great foothold, but it also went north to Tibet, starting in about the 7th century AD. And under a great king who had a Chinese wife who converted him to Buddhism. His name was Songtsen Gampo. And in the around 600s, he imported Buddhism from India. He invited teachers to come. At that time, Buddhism in Tibet, well, there was no written language in Tibet in the 7th century. The Tibetans hadn't developed writing yet. So Songtsen Gampo sent his prime minister to India, and that prime minister's name was Tongmi Sambuta, for anybody who cares, brought back the Sanskrit alphabet, and they adapted it to the Tibetan language, and that is what we have today for Tibetan, written Tibetan. In the 8th century, there was a great king who became a much more powerful exponent of Buddhism. His name was Trisong Detsen. And he invited, first he invited a Mahayana teacher named Shantarakshita to come, and he came and taught. And he tried to establish a monastery, Shantarakshita did, in Lhasa. But supposedly the story goes that Shantarakshita and his converted Tibetan monks would build the monastery by day, and the local deities of the Bun religion would tear it down by night. And finally, Shantarakshita went to the king, Trisong Detsen, and said, look, you need somebody who's got more juice than me. And there's this fellow in India that you ought to send for. His name is Padmasambhava. And so the king did, and Padmasambhava came. And he conquered or converted all these Bun local deities into Buddhism. And a lot of them today are some of the protectors of Indian Buddhism, and established monastic Buddhism in Lhasa and in Tibet. And it developed from there until the 9th century, when there was an evil king. For those of you who are Jews, this king was kind of the Haman of Tibetan Buddhism. He suppressed Buddhism. And then he was assassinated by this crazy monk who shot an arrow through the king's eye. and then Buddhism came back slowly. And so Buddhism developed in Tibet there in a number of stages. The Buddhism that developed from Padmasambhava in the 8th century, who was invited by King Trisong Detsen, is called the Old School. That's the Nyingma sect. That's what Nyingma means. It means the old ones. And they trace their lineage back to Padmasambhava and another great teacher named Vikramashila, who also brought Buddhism to Tibet. And then when Buddhism was suppressed, went underground, and then when that evil king was assassinated, and it started coming back slowly. And this is called the period of the new translation schools. And starting in the 11th century, people started going to India and bringing back Indian Buddhism. And one of the first and most famous of these was a fellow named Marpa. Marpa was a farmer, had a family, children, but he decided that he was going to go to India because maybe he could make some money by bringing back Buddhism and selling it. And of course, he got converted. And he went to India, which, can you imagine, in the 11th century, a trip across the Himalayas into northern India? Wow, that must have been one heck of a trip. And he did it more than once. He did it twice, at least. And he went into northern India, where he met the great teacher Naropa. And he became Naropa's student. And he got lots of teachings. And he had a fellow traveling companion, and he went back to Tibet with this fellow with all these teachings that he had collected from Naropa. And the other fellow was jealous, so the story goes. And when they were traveling across a river in a boat, the other fellow threw Naropa's texts into the river. And so Naropa lost a lot of these teachings that he was going to make money with. But he went back to Tibet, and the one teachings that he had absorbed and that he still had, he taught. And then he made another trip to India, and he went to see Naropa again, and this time Naropa was very fierce. And Naropa said to him, you ought to go see this other teacher, whose name was it Kamalashila? I've forgotten. Maitripa. It's one of the great teachers around in those days. And he went and he got the teachings and he brought them back to Tibet again. And what he was bringing back were the Mahamudra teachings. The Mahamudra means great seal or great symbol. Maha means great, mudra means seal or symbol. Mudra, like it's a hand gesture when you put your hands in a mudra on your lap. It means seal or symbol. So he brought these teachings back and taught them, and as well as other tantric teachings. Now, this is where we get into this chapter. Ultimate reality, of course, is described, first of all, by the doctrine of shunyata. Mahamudra is also used to refer to the nature of reality, but specifically to the nature of mind, the essential quality of which is shunyata, emptiness, luminous emptiness. What does that mean? That means that the person who is the adept, the person who has really understood this, has realized reality. And what reality is not this world of I and other that we, ordinary people, live in, and are where we're constantly lost in thought, all kinds of thoughts about this world that is unfolding with relentlessly for us in the present moment. This skin, these words, this thing in the present. And we're thinking about it. Do I like this? Do I like this teaching? Do I understand it? What am I going to do with it? Those are all the thoughts about it. So there are really sort of two modalities. One you might call the experiential body. And by body, I'm referring not only to this body, but to this world of the five senses as it arises now. This is the experiential body. And then there is the conceptual body, which lives up here, and which is all the thoughts that we're thinking about the experiential body. Do I like it? Do I not like it? What am I going to have for lunch? Am I worried about paying the rent? Blah, 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 blah. And so Mahamudra is really about coming back into the world of this corporeal body, this world which only exists in the present moment. And the present moment is out of time. It's not in a past or a future. That's going back to the conceptual body, the thinking body. What happened yesterday, what's going to happen tomorrow, all that lies in thought. But the experiential body, this body, is the world of Mahamudra. It's happening right now and only now. And there is no past or future. Those are conceptions of mind. And so Mahamudra refers to this essential emptiness. It's empty of concept, this present moment. Shunyata, luminous. It's when you begin to drop all the concepts which gray the world out, they leave us, they take us away into dreams, and we lose contact with the world, and the world becomes dim. But when we come back to this experiential body, this vivid body in the present moment, it is not only empty of I and other, of thought, it is luminous. Luminous means vivid, incredibly vivid and awake and arising. And this is what Mahamudra is about. It's about this luminous body of the present moment, shunyata, luminosity. And this, he says, when spiritual realization is accomplished, when you begin to really be able in your meditation to rest in this mind of the present moment, this experiential body, then luminous emptiness is experienced as pervasively and profoundly blissful, and enlightenment is characterized as luminous bliss. This is the Mahamudra. This is what the Mahamudra means. It means to come back to this. It's really what we're practicing in Shamatha Vipassana every morning. And then we get lost in thought, and you suddenly wake up and realize, oh, I've been dreaming about my mother in Poughkeepsie, for the last 10 minutes, and you beat yourself up about it, and that's another dream, And you say, oh, I'm a terrible meditator, another dream. And then eventually you come back, and here we are, sitting on this cushion or in this chair, in this room, with the light coming through the window. Maybe breakfast is about to happen or just did happen. And all of that is just real right now in the present moment. And this is what is called Mahamudra. In Tibetan, it's called Chakya Chenpo. Chenpo means great. Chakya is the word for mudra, but he translates it somewhat differently in this chapter. He says Chak denotes wisdom. Gya implies that this wisdom transcends mental defilement. That means mental defilement is just any kind of mentality that takes you out of the present moment. And Chenpo, who verifies that together they express a sense of unity. He's going a lot further than the literal meaning of those words in saying all that. At a more profound level of interpretation, Chakya Chenpo, Chakya suggests that our natural state of being this, the experiential body, right now, this, no concept, awake, here, has no origin, because we can't posit a particular time when it came into being. When did all this start? You can't remember your birth, and even if you could, that may not have been the beginning. Nor can we say what caused it to come into existence. That's a good one. Trying to figure that one out. You can say, well, my father inseminated my mother, but that's just theory. That's what somebody else told you. And what it is dependent upon, our natural state of being is self-sustaining, self-existing, and not dependent on anything. This state, this awareness, this clear, open awareness that we live in now is ongoing. The contents change all the time. And yet the awareness itself is always there. And unless we get distracted and dream and go off into dream, and then you got a different kind of awareness. But it's always awareness. So Traleg quotes Gampopa about this. So Mahamudra means non-duality, no I or other. Those ideas live in the realm of thought. And there's no samsara and nirvana either. They live in the realm of thought. They are the idea when we say, I want to get rid of my suffering. And suddenly we've got the suffering, samsara, and the idea of getting rid of it, nirvana. But in terms of what's really real here and now, those are just ideas. And they go poof and evaporate. Saraha says this in the 8th century. Saraha was a great teacher lived in the 8th century in India. And you could read some of Saraha. He's beautiful. It is the Royal Song of Saraha. He wrote 3 most powerful songs. They're called Doha. There was a long tradition in India of composing these poems. And he wrote the Song of the People, the Song of the King, and the Song of the Queen, the royal dohas. And he's credited with the actual being the originator of the Mahamudra tradition in his Song to the People, where he says, as is nirvana, so is samsara. They're just creations of mind. And this means that they're arising together as the birth of confusion, the birth of duality. We posit a terrible state that we want to get out of and a wonderful state that we want to get into. And he says, actually, neither is real except for us confused sentient beings who think they are. 2 seemingly opposite things have the same underlying nature or the same reality, which is the nature of emptiness, the only thing that's really real. So Mahamudra is a seal in the sense that it encompasses both samsara and nirvana and cannot be a mere philosophical view. It is reality, Mahamudra. It's this, the experiential body. All seeming polarities are inseparable within the realm of emptiness. Reality, good and bad, virtue and vice, beauty and ugliness, all of it. They are just names, just words, beauty and ugliness, reality and unreality, wisdom and confusion. They are all names that we attach and really come from our confused sense of self and our ambition for that sense of self. He says, emptiness is like space. This is Traleg again. It doesn't discriminate, but accommodates everything. Reality accommodates everything. As Saraha explains, this wonderful quote from Saraha, space is designated as empty, yet its exact nature can't be verbalized. You can't describe space. You can put all kinds of words on it, but we live in it, and yet you can't pin it down. Similarly, the mind is designated as luminously clear, yet its exact nature is empty. Empty of what? Empty of any definition, the mind, with no ground for definition. Thus, the self-nature of mind is and has been from the very beginning like that of space, in that it's undefinable. It's here. You know it's here, the space in this room, and yet you can't put it into words. You can try, and they're always inadequate. So the origins of the Kagyu Mahamudra tradition. The Mahamudra tradition is specific to the Kagyus, although it's spread to the other sects. Comes inherited from the Indian Mahasiddhas, such as Saraha, in the 8th century, and then a bunch of others, Savaripa Tilopa, who lived in the 10th and 11th centuries, and Maitripa, who also lived in the 11th century. It says, while the other Tibetan schools practice Mahamudra in conjunction with Tantrism. Now, Tantrism he's talking about as being working with deities like Vajrayogini and Chakrasamvara. I've got pictures of deities on the walls, and you do yidam practice. You visualize the deity in front of you and yourself as the deity, and you chant mantras, and you go through sadhanas. Sadhanas are texts, practice texts, and you read through them, and they take you through becoming and identifying with deity. And the idea is that you're going to transform yourself from this lowly, confused being that you think you are into the wisdom of the deity and the deity. And this is Tantrism. And so Mahamudra incorporated this, but it also had this other strain, which was the pure Mahamudra teachings of pure awareness. Awareness of what? This. You come back, and the teacher teaches you this awareness, one way or the other. He says, so while the other Tibetan schools practiced Mahamudra in conjunction with Tantrism, all the symbol and deities, in the Kagyu tradition, it is treated as a separate path to enlightenment, one that in fact transcends tantric methods and techniques. There are all kinds of tantric methods and techniques, breathing exercises, yogas, visualization, mantra. But Mahamudra is completely silent. It's an awareness practice completely. And it emphasizes the concept of self-liberation as opposed to the tantric idea of self-transformation, transforming yourself into something holy, a deity. This is unique to the Kagyu school. And many teachers teach both. Trungpa Rinpoche did. He taught us all tantric practice as well as Mahamudra. And in fact, he taught Mahamudra from get-go. Call it Mahamudra. In the Nyingma tradition, they call it great perfection, Dzogchen. And the practice that they teach to recognize it is called cutting through, Trekchen. So, we go here, there's all this history that I think I've already given you. Mahayana went to China. Tantrism went to China too, but it never really took hold as much as it did in Tibet when it went from India to Tibet. The Chinese brought it back, and Chinese visited Tibet and taught Tantra and Mahamudra, but it was a much paler version than what the Tibetans had gotten from India. And the Mahayana, of course, as it went to China, emphasized compassion and transcendent seeing non-duality, which is certainly part of Mahamudra. Emphasized the concepts of shunyata, which we've talked about a little bit, karuna, which is compassion, and prajna, which is transcendent seeing through the belief in I and other, and upaya, skillful means, acting in concert with transcendent vision and compassion. And the whole path was articulated. There were two main schemes. One is the 5 paths, which we went through a bit in volume 2 of the Profound Treasury. And the other was the 10 bhumis, which we also went through. And these were, especially the 10 bhumis, were articulations of the Mahayana path, the path of the Bodhisattva. And the 5 paths is an articulation of the entire journey. A bunch of writings developed. In India, the Prajnaparamita teachings, sutras, appeared probably, nobody really knows for sure because, again, the lack of written history, but probably appeared sometime in the 2nd century BC. And the oldest of the Prajnaparamita, there are many, many Prajnaparamita texts. There's the Prajnaparamita in 100,000 lines. There's the Prajnaparamita in 100,000 verses, excuse me. There is the Prajnaparamita in 8,000 verses. It's called the Astasahasrika, and it's probably the oldest of the Prajnaparamita texts. And then there are Prajnaparamita in shorter and shorter versions till you get to the Prajnaparamita in 1 page. That's the one that we chant. Thus have I heard once the Blessed One was dwelling in Rajagriha, and so forth. That's in the Prajnaparamita in 1 page. And then there's even the Prajnaparamita in 1 letter, the letter A, which is the first letter of the Tibetan and Sanskrit alphabet. And it symbolizes all the Prajnaparamita teachings. And the Prajnaparamita, of course, is all about the fact that I and other don't exist. In fact, nothing exists. Everything is shunya, empty of own being, empty of time. It's just this experiential body that is happening now beyond words. And so in India, schools arose. The 2 main schools that arose in India, one was called the Madhyamaka school. It arose in around the 2nd century, around a figure whose name was Nagarjuna. And Nagarjuna was the founder of the Madhyamaka school. Madhyamaka literally means the middle way path, and it was all about shunyata and the Prajnaparamita. It was kind of a philosophical explanation of the Shunya Vada teachings, the Prajnaparamita teachings. And that arose in India starting in around 150 or so AD. And then the other main school, the Mahayana school that developed in India, was the Yogacara school, also called the Chittamatra, meaning mind-only school. And that was founded by a man named Asanga in the 4th century AD, and his brother, who he converted. He converted his own brother. His own brother was a Hinayana teacher, a famous one, and he converted them into the Mahayana, and specifically into the Yogacara school, which really was all about the teachings of mind only. And that took place again in the 4th and 5th centuries BC. So this is a brief history. Now, what was happening at the same time was that Tantrism was developing in the forests. Forest yogis were practicing Tantric Buddhism, and it came into the monasteries and into the great universities around the same time, around 400 or 500 AD, and it developed there as well as these Mahayana schools. So it was a very rich period. And when it went to Tibet, starting in the 7th century, the Tibetans organized it. It had already was being organized in India into these 3 vehicles of the Hinayana, the so-called lesser vehicle, which was primarily the Sarvastivada teachings of the Buddha, the Mahayana, the greater vehicle, and the Vajrayana, which was all about Tantra, and it included Mahamudra, and it included the Great Perfection. So it's the most advanced teachings. This is a lot to take in. Says, a lay movement was quietly emerging using yogic techniques to transform body, speech, and mind from ordinary to awakened enlightenment. And the teachings of this movement were known as tantras. Tantra is a word that has a number of meanings. One is that it refers to the texts of the Vajrayana, of Tantra. And there are a lot of them. It also has a meaning. Tantra, the literal meaning of that word in Sanskrit is continuity, and it refers primarily to the continuity of mind, that awareness in the present moment is continuous. It just goes on. There's no break. Even when you close your eyes, even when you lose consciousness, there's consciousness of something. And it has to do with the continuity of enlightened qualities as well, which are already present and being brought forward rather than being created anew. enlightenment is always here, and that Tantra refers to that continuity. It was, it says, Tantra was controversial in that it asserted that a practitioner of Tantra could achieve enlightenment in a single lifetime. Prior to the Tantric movement developing in Buddhism, it was going to take, enlightenment would take many lifetimes, many. The Mahayana, they say, what did he say here in this text? That 3 measureless eons described in the Mahayana, and it was worse in the Hinayana. It was going to take you so long. But the Mahayana retained the ideal of the Bodhisattva and brought in Madhyamaka and Yogacara philosophy with their doctrines of Tathagata Garbha, Buddha nature. All of that came in. So you can see this is an extraordinarily rich period of development of thought. And sadhana practice was also further developed. It says the ultimate goal or culmination of their practice was to realize the luminous bliss of the awakened mind. And so the term Mahamudra is used to describe the highest teachings of the Buddhist tantras that predominated in northwest India around 750 to 1150 CE, AD. And these practitioners of these teachings were called Mahasiddhas. Maha means great, Siddha means power holders. And there are 2 kinds of powers that these siddhas held. The powers are called siddhis, and the holders of them were called siddhas, siddha. And there were 2 main kinds, what were called ordinary and supreme. Ordinary were magical powers like the ability to read minds, walk through walls, fly in the air, that kind of thing. But the supreme siddhi is enlightenment itself. And these Mahasiddhas were a lot of them, not all of them, very eccentric human beings. And I think I've described some of my favorites. But there were lots of them. Like, for instance, Marpa, when he went to India the second time, and he went to Naropa, and he asked him for teachings, Naropa said, no, you have to go and get teachings now from this other guy. His name is Kukuripa. And Kukuripa lived on an island in the middle of a poisonous lake. And Marpa had to make his way somehow in a boat, I guess, across the waters of this poisonous lake to this island where Kukuripa lived, surrounded by dogs. And the dogs were not friendly. And Marpa had to make his way through this pack of dogs and find Kukuripa, and he did get teachings, which he took back to Tibet. Very important teachings of Mahamudra, in fact. All these terrific stories. All these are written up, by the way, in some different books. There's a book, there was a great historian named Taranatha who wrote a history which you can read. It's been translated. It's called The 7 Instruction Lineages. And there's another named Abhayadatta who wrote the lives of the 84 Mahasiddhas, and I've got it sitting up here on my desk, on my bookshelf. It's been translated by Keith Dowman. And these works depict tantric yogis and yoginis as members of a non-monastic, non-celibate movement. They were having sex, tantric sex. So Tantra developed outside the monasteries and universities, and then emerged as a popular form in those institutions, the monasteries and universities, in around the 8th century in India. And Taranatha wrote around the 6th century. And he says, in most cases, most of the major tantras had been revealed by the 8th and 9th centuries. We'll see. I'm not familiar, but we don't read tantras. Tantras tend to be these texts. They're attributed to the Buddha. You see, toward the end of his life, the Buddha went south to a kingdom in the south where the king told him, look, I'm a king. I'm surrounded by courtiers. We're not going to become monks and nuns like most of your students. Can you give us teachings that are suitable for lay people, appropriate for lay people? And so supposedly, the legend has it that the Buddha gave the first tantric teaching he gave the Kala Chakra, which means the wheel of time teaching. And this is generally regarded as the oldest tantric teaching. And it's a text, a tantra. Now, these texts, just for your information, are very, very concise, short, and difficult. You need a very accomplished teacher and expositor of these texts to translate them and make them understandable for you. So let's see. He says, some teachers promoted Mahamudra as the apex of Tantra, and others, such as Saraha and Maitripa, promoted it as a separate and different path from Tantrism. That's really interesting, because that's the way Traleg Rinpoche is teaching it, as a separate path from Tantra. It's a faster path when it's translated this way, when it's taught this way. It's a path of true realization right now, awake. It's really the ultimate expression of shamatha vipassana, clear, open awareness, which understands that this moment, here, the experiential body is it, and that any kind of concept is confusion. In his Doha, Saraha says, and I just wrote this down, I just love Saraha. You should read the King's, actually the royal song. Yeah, the King's song. It's just fierce and gorgeous. And he says, reality, is empty of any mandala. See, mandala is part of Tantra, the magic and, mandalas, texts, mudras, esoteric practices. But Saraha says the reality, which is the Mahamudra, is empty of any mandala, empty of devotees who make burned offerings, because that's what they do in Tantra, detached from any mantras, mudras, and visualization of deities. It cannot be realized through tantras and shastras. This indestructible awareness, which is our own natural state of being, is perfect in its natural state. And this is what Saraha taught. It's what Trungpa Rinpoche taught. He taught both. He was teaching both. An historical synopsis of the Kagyu Mahamudra tradition. Well, no, I'm not going to go into that. We've already done it. It's Marpa who brought it to Tibet, and it became part of his sect, the sect that he founded, the Kagyu sect. Kagyu means the lineage of the word. That's what Kagyu means. Ka is word, and Gyu means, actually Gyu is the word for Tantra. It means continuity, lineage. And Mahamudra tradition that Marpa received, it was systematized and popularized by his heir, first of all by Milarepa, who actually taught Tantra. He taught all of the esoteric practices, mudras, mantras, practices. But his student, Gampopa, focused mainly on Mahamudra, the pure mind transmission, awareness practice. It was only Gampopa, he says, who made it independent of tantric practices and empowerment so that it became a separate practice unto itself, Mahamudra. And then he quotes Takpo Tashi Namgyal, who was a famous Kagyu in the 20th century, 19th. He explains in his Mahamudra manual, the teachers of this meditational lineage up to Milarepa meditated mainly on the key instructions of the Mantrayana mysticism, Tantra, while at various times incorporating vital instructions on Mahamudra, that's the pure awareness practice, from the discourses on the yogas of inner heat and lucid awareness. Those were tantric practices. Inner heat, raising Dumo. Yet the great master Gampopa, having been moved by immeasurable compassion, expounded mainly on the quintessential instructions on Mahamudra. It's the fastest path. As a result, it became widely known as a single path for all predestined seekers. I think we're just about finished here. And then Michael, let's see. he says that there was another teacher named Gola Sawa who mentions that prior to Gampopa, Mahamudra teachings were given as highly secret instructions to practitioners who had received tantric teachings. It was the next step. Gampopa revolutionized this. Not only did he extract the Mahamudra practice as self-sufficient doctrine, he also significantly liberalized its dispersion by giving instructions outside the tantric environment. He was the first. And he lived in about the 1000s. While Milarepa did not teach Mahamudra separate from the tantric teachings, Gampopa began to give tantric initiations to select students and Mahamudra teachings to all the rest, without giving them tantric initiations. He thus initiated a widespread practice of separating the Mahamudra cycle of teachings, all about pure awareness, from their tantric origins. Tantric meaning having to do with a lot of form. Gampopa preferred to teach this simple, direct insight into the nature of mind. And this is what we're going to be studying, this Mahamudra, simple, direct insight into the nature of mind. That's what this book is about. It's not going to be about Vajrayogini practice or Yidam practice or working with the protectors. So Gampopa felt that people could learn to realize their true nature directly through the use of more simple methods of the Mahamudra teachings. And at this point, I'm turning it over to Michael.
Okay, so I think one thing that becomes really clear is that there are a lot of different schools, views, and practices that have developed since the time of the Buddha. I think it's helpful to keep in mind something that we studied in the Mahayana Lojong slogans, that all dharmas agree at one point. That one point is the purpose of practice is to overcome ego or overcome ignorance. And in the section that I'm going to talk about in this chapter, the different vehicles for the path of enlightenment, that's really the purpose of all of them. I always enjoy reading different teachers because each teacher, Traleg Rinpoche, Trungpa Rinpoche, has their own style, their own language, their own way of phrasing things. And yet at the same time, it's always the same thing. They're always pointing to the same things. So it's helpful to hear it in different words. It's helpful to hear it with different examples. It's helpful to hear it with a different style of presentation. But ultimately, all dharmas agree at one point, and that where there seems to be contradictions, if we look further, often it's precisely because they're talking about the nature of the view and practice in regard to the different vehicles, which have some differences, but ultimately aim to overcome ego or ultimately aim to overcome ignorance. And that's what how Traleg Rinpoche begins this section. He says that the fundamental aim of Buddhist practice is to achieve enlightenment, to emulate the Buddha, and that the practice is learning how to perceive ourselves in a genuine and authentic fashion, so that we're no longer in conflict with dark subconscious corners of the mind acting on our conscious awareness and disturbing its peace. So one thing I find in reading Traleg Rinpoche is it's easy to let a sentence slip by without thinking about it very much. But if we just think about that for a moment, the point is that we most often don't perceive ourselves in a genuine and authentic fashion. And that the purpose of each one of these vehicles is to help us overcome ignorance and wake up. There are different methods for doing that, and there are different views in regard to the practice. But ultimately, again, all dharmas agree at one point. Traleg Rinpoche further says that everything that is going on in the mind has the potential to become conscious so that nothing is hidden anymore. And that's really the goal of all practice, but in particular Mahamudra, and in particular as well Mahamudra, coming to perceive ourselves in a genuine and authentic fashion, coming to realize our true nature, which is fundamentally awake. In one sense, it's very simple for all the complications, and it really comes down to very simple things. As one teacher I heard once said, it's samsaric mind that's complicated, and that's why Buddhism has all of these different schools and different methods to address all of the complications of samsaric mind, conceptual mind. But ultimately, what Buddhism teaches in one sense is very simple. And we'll really see that, I think, as we move into Mahamudra further in this text. In any case, he goes on to say, in regard to the different vehicles for the path to enlightenment, Traleg says that the Buddha himself said that his teachings varied in order to benefit people of different dispositions, interests, and needs. And in fact, if you were to attend a teaching with a Tibetan guru, Tibetan master, one of the things that's often recited is the traditional request for teachings, which is worded like this: in accordance with the capabilities and diverse aspirations of sentient beings, I ask you to turn the wheel of Dharma of the greater, lesser, or conventional vehicles. So all of this material can be helpful to us. And as John said, Trungpa Rinpoche taught it all, because it not only are different teachings helpful to different people of different capabilities and aspirations, but even ourselves, depending on how we are and our state of being in the moment, might find that one style or one method of practicing is more beneficial at one time than at another. And I think this will become clear as we go along. At least I hope it will. In any case, as John said, in the Tibet, the Buddhist teachings are typically divided into three broad categories: the Hinayana, which Traleg Rinpoche says is a lesser vehicle, Mahayana, greater vehicle, and Vajrayana are indestructible vehicle. Hinayana is usually called the lesser vehicle because the goal is individual salvation, freeing ourselves, awakening ourselves. The goal of Mahayana is awakening, freeing, liberating all sentient beings, hence it's the greater vehicle. And Vajrayana is indestructible because of the nature of the realization, the nature of the experience that one has through Vajrayana study and practice, and ultimately is the fruition or the complete perfection of Hinayana and Mahayana. At the same time, as Trungpa Rinpoche said, and I'm sure we'll get to this in Traleg's work as well, the Hinayana and Mahayana are necessary foundations for Vajrayana practice. Traleg also introduces a fourth vehicle, Sahajayana, which I had not heard of before. This was a first for me, which he says is the vehicle of co-emergence. He translates the Tibetan as being born together with, and says the Mahamudra approach can be described as Sahajayana as opposed to Tantrayana. And in this sense, as John was saying, that the Mahamudra teachings are a unique and separate vehicle in their own right. Co-emergence is a huge topic that's not very simply explained, and ultimately relates to non-conceptual experience, so all the more difficult to try to put it into some kind of words. But generally speaking, I hope this is helpful rather than confusing. In co-emergence refers to the fact that in every instant, both wakefulness and ignorance, or awareness and confusion, arise simultaneously. It's born together, connate. It's also said that appearance, emptiness are co-emergent or connate, that they're inseparable. And the way that they relate is that with appearances that arise, we've failed to see that appearances arise are expressions of awareness, expressions of Rigpa in the Ati tradition, expression of ordinary mind or the nature of mind in the Mahamudra tradition. And because we failed to see their true nature, which would be wisdom, we take them to be external, separate, and take us to have be separate from the appearances that we perceive, and in that way get lost in confusion and ignorance. So it's this Mahamudra aims to overcome that, as does Ati. So Mahamudra and Mahati, but there's a lot of compatibility, you could say, between the two traditions. Traleg goes on to say that the Kagyu tradition identifies four fundamental approaches to enlightenment: renunciation, purification, transformation, and liberation, or self-liberation. And he connects each of these with the different yanas. So the Hinayana is connected to path of renunciation, Mahayana with purification, the Vajrayana or the tantric practices such as deity visualization practice with transformation, and Mahamudra or Suhajayana with self-liberation. And he also divides these different teachings, these different methods of practice, these different views into three different categories that he says he'll use throughout the book. So I'm going to spend just a little bit of time with these. So the first is the exoteric, which connects with both Hinayana and Mahayana teachings. The esoteric, which he connects with the Vajrayana, and mystical with Mahamudra, which is obviously what the text is mostly about. And by the way, just the title of the text, Mind at Ease, says a whole lot about what Mahamudra is. So there's quite a bit actually even in just that title. In any case, exoteric teachings, Hinayana and Mahayana, exoteric basically means that they're meant to be understood by the general public. They're the most easily understood of the Buddhist teachings, the most immediately graspable. Whereas esoteric tends to mean that it's knowledge or practices that are usually not public or common knowledge, that they're more likely to be understood by only a small number of people with specialized knowledge and interest. Again, exoteric refers to knowledge or practices commonly taught or shared. And then finally, mystical or mysticism. Mystical means having a spiritual meaning or reality that is neither apparent to the senses nor obvious to the intelligence. So I think this is another way of, in regard to Mahamudra, of talking about the non-conceptual nature of Mahamudra experience, that it's not something that's obvious to the conceptual mind. Mysticism is also defined as the sense of some form of contact, some form of experience. The dictionary definition says with the divine, but I think we could probably switch divine and say sacred, in the sense of just immediate experience of things as they are in the Buddhist tradition, rather than divine in the theistic tradition, or transcendent. So again, this is what's connected with Mahamudra, some kind of contact with the sacred or the transcendent that's beyond conceptual mind. This is very similar, by the way, to what we studied last week, where Trungpa Rinpoche talked about the self-secret nature of Vajrayana, where he says it's difficult to understand the Vajrayana because of its secretness, and that it's self-secret, that we have to understand the meaning behind the whole thing before we conceive an understanding of Vajrayana secretness. So we actually just went over this material last week, so this part on esoteric and mystical in particular applies directly to this self-secret quality that Trungpa Rinpoche talked about in the chapter we read last week. He said secretness and sacredness are the same thing, that in the Vajrayana, secrecy does not mean that something is hidden because it's criminal, but it means something that is inconceivable to others. They would not understand it. Therefore, it's hidden until they see it. So with that, we can talk about the four methods that the Kagyu lineage talks about in regard to the yanas. So again, we begin with the exoteric teaching, the Hinayana, and this begins with the path of renunciation, the practice of renunciation. Some teachers, sometimes you'll read about this as the path of abandonment. But the basic idea of Hinayana practice is that because we're so caught up in speedy mind, distracted mind, absorbed mind, mind following thought after thought, emotion after emotion, that we have little to no contact with reality. And we experience this in our own lives. If you've ever had the experience of driving a car or walking somewhere and realizing that you've gotten somewhere, but you almost have no memory of how you got there because you were so preoccupied, then that's an experience of, distracted mind, absorbed mind, fixated mind. And so we begin with the path of renunciation, which we achieve work with through meditation practice, where we tame the mind and begin to let go of or wake up from our absorption in thought after thought, dream after dream, fantasy after fantasy. We begin to let go, renounce our involvement with especially the kleshas, passion, aggression, and ignorance. we begin to see through or work through the attachments that we have to worldly activities that cause us, that obscure awareness, that keep us distracted, keep us so busy that we're not present at all most of the time. And this is in the Hinayana what we do to tame the mind through shamatha vipassana practice. As Traleg Rinpoche says, when we're on the spiritual path, there are many things we might notice within ourselves that we don't like, want, or need. And he gives the examples: excessive anger, jealousy, extreme forms of selfishness or self-centeredness, hatred, violence, and so forth. And in order to rid ourselves of these things, to displace them from our consciousness, we renounce them in favor of a more caring attitude. So this is the Hinayana practice of basically abandoning, renouncing those habitual tendencies of mind, particularly the conflicting emotions, strong passion, aggression, and ignorance, that keep us trapped in confusion, keep us trapped in ignorance. Again, all dharmas agree at one point, which is to overcome ego, overcome ignorance. And as part of this, we study and practice and try to develop a personal relationship, see what it means to us personally in our actual lives. The fundamental doctrines of the Buddha, the Four Noble Truths, the notion of selflessness or egolessness, dependent origination, karma and rebirth, and individual salvation within nirvana. So that's the path of renunciation in a very brief nutshell. The next one connects with the Mahayana, which is again is an exoteric practice, shared commonly. Purification. The Mahayana teachings relate to the purification. And he begins this by saying that the Mahayana teachings relate to negative mental states and emotions in a more open and accommodating manner, aiming to reconcile and purify these emotions rather than attempting the more aggressive eradication of the Hinayana approach. So at this point, we're really opening to the world. And in terms of relating to and being more open to negative mental states and emotions in a more open way, we don't need to go any further than to think about Tonglen practice for those who are familiar with it, where we actually invite negativity. We invite the suffering of others. We take it on. And because we have some recognition of emptiness, we're able to let go. We're able to see it in a wider view. And we're able to share whatever positive goodness, strength, healthiness, sanity we have. So in that sense, again, we're reconciling and purifying emotions rather than attempting just to simply eradicate them. We actually, in the Mahayana, begin to have some appreciation of the helpfulness of suffering in order to develop compassion for others, because we come to understand with a wider view the nature of suffering and compassion. Similarly, paramita practice. Through paramita practice, we open ourselves to the world, to sentient beings in an open way. That, for instance, with the paramita of generosity, we let go of self-centeredness, miserliness, and give way and develop instead a sense of generosity. Or the paramita of patience, where we work with aggression quite directly. So this is what he means. The paramita practice in particular is what Traleg Rinpoche means when he says that the main methods of Mahayana are the practices of wisdom, which is the 6 paramita prajna, and compassion. And that we start by recognizing that we're subject to conflicting emotions. We experience passion, aggression, and ignorance. We experience these and make an effort to deepen our insight into the actual nature of the emotions themselves. This is very much a Vipassana practice, where we actually look at the nature of our experience, begin to look at the nature of, what we experience in mind. It's interesting that he says he considers Mahayana exoteric, because when you get to fruition, it's not always so easily understood. But the last part of this section, the purification, he says that with fruition, he says instead of trying to escape from negative states, we begin to see that the nature of negative mental states is ultimately the same as the nature of the positive mental states we're trying to develop. We stop thinking dualistically in terms of there being intrinsically good or bad. We begin to see instead emptiness, the lack of self-nature, the lack of solidity, the impermanence of all these different states of mind. From the point of view of ultimate reality, which is shunyata or emptiness, there is no difference between the two states because they are both imbued with the same reality, the reality of emptiness. Although he's also very clear to say there is a difference on the relative level. Ignorance is not wisdom. Defilement is not sanity. But on a deeper level, they have the same underlying reality. And so this is the fruition of Mahayana, recognizing emptiness. Just to go back for a moment to the paramita of patience, which works particularly with aggression and anger. I'm thinking of this section in Shanti Deva's text, The Way of the Bodhisattva, where he talks about the paramita of patience. And he begins by talking about aggression, that when we experience a moment of intense anger, intense aggression, that we should be like a log, that we should. But then the rest of the chapter really goes into looking at the nature of aggression and coming to understand why people are aggressive, that people do things because their minds aren't tamed and that they're not really in control of what they do. He makes the point that people injure themselves and people kill themselves. And to think that they should treat us better is really, foolish. So that, again, it begins with, my point here is that it begins with something of the notion of the path of renunciation, be like a log. But then it goes further into understanding more of the nature of aggression and anger so that we can let it go and develop a wider view. So that's the notion of purification. So the third path that it talks about is the path of transformation, which, as John talked about, involves deity practice, visualization of deities, the use of mantras, and the use of certain kinds of physical exercises like tumo or the Chandali practice. We develop internal heat. Not to give too many different labels for these things, but other texts will talk about this as the path of method. That all of these have a different method. But the point of all of them is to help us recognize the true nature of mind. And in that sense, they can actually be helpful in terms of Mahamudra practice. But the basic idea is that, as he says, transformation occurs because we associate our psychic tendencies and states like confusion with visualization of different peaceful and wrathful deities in sexual union, and so on. And that this allows us to transform confusion into opposite qualities. And this happens because visualization practice involves letting go of our ordinary way of looking at things and developing some sense of appearance emptiness through visualization. In any case, again, he makes the point that strong emotions cloud our judgment, but it's not the emotions themselves that are the source of our anguish, that the pain has to be attributed to our lack of clear and distinct insight into the true nature of our conflicting emotions. Again, all dharmas agree at one point, which is overcoming ego, overcoming ignorance. So then the final approach, which is the Mahamudra approach, is self-liberation, or sometimes called path of liberation. And in this case, as Traleg Rinpoche says, and as John emphasized, we're not trying to renounce, purify, or transform anything at all. That the idea is to allow negativities to become self-liberated. That so long as we try to renounce, purify, or transform, we're trying to do or contrive something and along with that, we see ourselves as flawed in some way. And when we do this, when we deliberately try to eradicate conflicting emotions, for instance, we perpetuate a negative view of some kind, we solidify. And ultimately, because these emotions have no intrinsic nature, again, this is the nature of shunyata, and the Mahamudra method incorporates this view from the outset, the empty nature of mind. And in so doing, it cuts right through conflicting emotions on the spot, rather than wear them out, eliminate them, or transform them. As he says, we simply enter immediately into our own spiritual being. We rest in our natural state. We simply recognize the nature of mind. And if we're able to do this, if we're able to recognize the true nature of mind, then liberation is automatic. Although he does say that it's not that we become enlightened instantly, but the conflicting emotions that obscure our enlightenment can become self-liberated naturally. In a sense, we experience this when we're able to not engage with thoughts, but see that they just arise, subside, and disappear. And in that sense, we don't have to do anything with them. If we just see them and let them rise and subside freely in meditation practice, they self-liberate, which is the idea that we're talking about here. This is called Rangdral in Tibetan. And he says that self-liberation is achieved through recognizing our innate state of being, or the nature of mind, according to the Mahamudra teachings. And again, that self-liberation comes through resisting the temptation to deliberately try to create a particular state of mind, which we often do in obvious or subtle ways. Even so subtle as having a positive, or what we feel is a positive experience in meditation, and then trying to hold on to it, so that we go from the mind of the present to the mind of the past, even though it was the past of just a moment before. When we're able to let go of, not engage with the temptation to try to create particular states of mind, we practice Mahamudra. Instead, we just allow ourselves to be with whatever arises in the mind. And it concludes by saying when we allow things to come and go without fixating on them, without trying to solidify, correct, or react to them, everything can become self-liberated. So quite a bit for tonight. We only have a few minutes left, but I guess there's some time for questions, comments, and thoughts. And we, of course, have discussion group tomorrow night. Lodra?
Thank you. I'm wondering if there are any fundamental differences between Mahamudra and Mahā'ati.
John might be able to answer that better than I can. I think there's some differences in some of the practices, but generally speaking, they're very compatible. I mean, that's the whole point of the sadhana of Mahamudra. If you've done that practice, that they both see the fundamental nature of mind as pure and awake, and that it's, that we get caught because we don't recognize that, we don't see that. We mistake appearances, which are the expression of awake or rigpa or ordinary mind or whatever you want to call it, as, again, something external, separate, and then get caught up in duality and take appearances to be solid, and then get caught up in all the strategies of ego, trying to take in and hold on to what we see as positive, push away or what's negative, and ignore the rest, instead of just being awake.
Thank you.
I think at their core, they're very similar. There are differences as well. And Mahamudra is very connected with Tantra. Dzogchen at the highest levels, actually Dzogchen altogether, is not. There's no visualization of deity. The recitation of mantra is devotional. It's not meant to be a meditation technique. In Dzogchen, there are only two practices, fundamentally. One is very similar to the Mahamudra that he's talking about here. It's called cutting through, trekchit. And what it's cutting through to is original purity. The word trekchit means cutting through. And I never realized it at the time, but Rinpoche named his first book, Cutting Through Spiritual Materialism. I mean, he was so Ati Sogjen oriented from the beginning. And but they're very, very similar in the sense of cutting through to pure awareness. Dzogchen also has a second practice that is not present in the Mahamudra tradition. It's called Tugel, which is generally translated as leaping over. And it's optional. It depends on the individual, whether they're going to practice one, the other, or both. They're very different practices. Tugel has to do with seeing, truly seeing, not visualizing, this world as sacred. And it requires trekchit, the pure, effortless seeing of reality, in order to then see this sacredness, which is quite extraordinary. And they say in the Dzogchen tradition that trekchit, cutting through, which is very similar to what we're going to be studying with Mahamudra, is the lazy person's path to enlightenment. It's effortless. Requires giving up effort, because effort, any kind of effort, has as its foundation the idea that I need to change. I need to change. And that goes a complete relaxing into reality. Tugel, the second practice in Dzogchen, has to do with seeing that reality once one has relaxed into it. And there are techniques for that. And they say that that's the path for people who want to work hard. Yeah. And so they're both really based on the same effortless awareness of mind and reality. Both of them. I find that there's a chauvinism in Dzogchen where they say that anything below the Dzogchen path is not equal to it, because anything below the Dzogchen path has some idea of path, like I'm going to go from here to there, like I'm going to get something by doing something. And that idea of cause and effect, getting something, they regard as delusory, whereas the pure Dzogchen path is just an uncovering of what we already are. But personally, when I listen to the teachings on Mahamudra, I've been studying Dzogchen for, I don't know, 15, 20 years. And I find the teachings on Mahamudra completely, the pure teachings on Mahamudra that Traleg is giving us, very, very similar.
I had a question.
Yes.
I just wondered if there's any of these paths where awakening or enlightenment is not the goal.
Is not what?
It is not the goal. Is it possible just to be on these paths and not care if you become enlightened or not?
That's the best path. That's absolutely the best path.
I don't know if it's just I'm hearing it wrong, but it seems like I keep hearing that enlightenment is the goal. And if you
Yes.
take away.
Yes and no. Even in this chapter, he says, when you understand Mahamudra, enlightenment and confusion are gone. They are born together, because as soon as we feel that we don't like what we are and we want to change it, then there's the idea of confusion and enlightenment. Enlightenment becomes, the escape, the solution. But in reality, when we become Buddha, they're both gone. both gone. They were myths. They were products of confused mind. Michael, do you agree with this? This is such a difficult point.
I think that's it.
Yeah. He said it's there in the chapter.
And that's another way in which Mahāti and Mahamudra are pretty similar, that, again, we misperceive. And out of that comes ignorance. But if we're able to see true nature, Rigpa, ordinary mind, nature of mind, whatever you want to call it, if we're able to be with that, be in that, be that, it is who we are, identify with that, then there's the duality vanishes, because it was a misperception to begin with.
But there is
maybe
a moving into a different world.
Maybe the question is, why do we practice and study? And actually, we're out of time. I shouldn't have asked that.
Thank you. That'll have to wait until next week.
But don't stop practicing.
Yeah.
Until you know.
Thank you.
I mean, the picture that they draw is of the enlightened person. It's just free and playing with the universe, not going anywhere in particular. It's just constant, in constant responsiveness, play, communication, making love. That's the picture that we get of the truly enlightened person. And there's no going from here to there, from confusion to enlightenment. That's a real drag, that journey from confusion to enlightenment. But the irony is that when you get enlightened, then that's when you really realize there was no journey. What a funny conundrum.
Oh, it's 9 o'clock.
It is. Okay, so we should end. Somebody going to lead the chants? I can't do it. Thanks, Ben.
We will close by reciting a prayer for peace and then dedicating the merit earned by our practice for the benefit of all sentient beings. By the blessings of enlightened and compassionate ones, by the power of my positive actions of 3 times and my prayers of pure aspiration, may wars, conflicts, epidemics, and all other maladies dissolve in this world, and may the earth and all who live on this earth enjoy the abundance of well-being. May all learn to live lovingly with each other. By this merit, may all obtain omniscience. May it defeat the enemy, wrongdoing. From the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death, from the ocean of samsara, may I free all beings. By the confidence of the golden sun of the great East, may the lotus garden of the Rigdon's wisdom bloom. May the dark ignorance of sentient beings be dispelled. May all beings enjoy profound, brilliant glory.